Herr Dr. Eberhard, eine gängige These zur Erklärung von Nahtoderfahrungen ist...
Dr. Eberhard, a common theory to explain near-death experiences is that they are projections of the brain. The brain would create impressions based on religious or other expectations in order to make dying easier for the person. The near-death experience fulfills expectations of the afterlife. What do you think about this hypothesis?
It can be said with certainty that near-death experiencers are surprised by what they experience, regardless of which worldview they belong to. A materialist who is not at all convinced that life outside the body is possible suddenly experiences exactly that. He sees his own body from the outside. He is astonished. He is irritated. He may try to intervene in a situation, but he can't because, for example, he simply passes through other people he perceives. They don't see him, but he sees them. He understands them. He hears them. He even perceives what they are thinking. That is not what a materialist expects. But there are also values that dissolve into nothing. People who are convinced that they love their family incredibly, that they would do anything for them, realize in their near-death experience that this is no longer so relevant to them. They would even stay where they are in their experience if they had the choice. So there is always a clear contrast between what you expect and what you actually experience. This also applies to the panorama of life. For example, you had an interview with Mr. Johann Josef Atzmüller, who described this very impressively. He came to the point in his life review where he steals money and experiences it as comparatively insignificant. But an event in his life that he had regarded as trivial turned out to be highly significant. He had annoyed his sister and now experiences the situation again and again in the panorama of his life, until, as he recounts, he overcomes his pride and apologizes inwardly. He was therefore confronted with completely different judgments. This happens frequently, especially when looking back on life. But there are also bizarre experiences that you probably wouldn't expect. I'm thinking of a very young patient I looked after who was seriously ill with COVID. He had a near-death experience in the intensive care unit. He also experienced the tunnel. He didn't want to die. That's why he was afraid of this tunnel and of the light figure that came towards him through the tunnel. He resisted it. Then this experience broke off. He experienced his brother traveling in a train and going through a tunnel and swearing like a madman. Such examples show very clearly that no expectations are fulfilled in near-death experiences.
Near-death experiences therefore certainly provide surprises and do not always fulfill expectations. In this context, I would also like to specifically address religious beliefs, even more specifically Christian beliefs. Many Christians assume that there is a kingdom of God in which they are, as believers, will live after death, that they will be received by God or by Jesus. To what extent do near-death experiences confirm such ideas?
Near-death experiences can confirm religious beliefs or not. The variance is simply very large. We are faced with a fundamental problem with near-death experiences. Reports of such experiences are only ever an attempt to convey what has been experienced. Near-death experiencers say this very clearly. They don't have the words for it. They can only try to express what they have experienced. So with the different statements, we have the problem. Do people really mean the same thing when they use the same words? What is experience and what is just an afterthought? Statements about near-death experiences are therefore very different for this reason alone. And there are also differences due to the culture and religion of the near-death experiencers. For these reasons, we cannot expect near-death experiences to correspond exactly to a particular religious concept.
Could it be that many people experience similar things? for example tunnels or encounters with light, but that they interpret these experiences differently because of their religious background.
At least that's how it seems. It is difficult to judge to what extent expectations or perhaps illusions play a role in a near-death experience. Illusion, in contrast to hallucination, is based on something that is really there. If you are talking to me now, but when you leave the room I have the impression that you are a dog, then that is an illusion. You are there, but I don't recognize you or interpret you differently. If, on the other hand, I were to perceive something that is not there, it would be a hallucination. To what extent are near-death experiences characterized by such illusions? To what extent do expectations play a role? It is not possible to make a general judgment on all of this. There are Indian near-death experiencers who encounter Yama, the god of the dead. There are Christians who say they have met Jesus. What is striking in any case, and according to my observations also applies to religious phenomena such as Marian apparitions, is that if you take a closer look at the reports, it is not the apparition itself that says, for example, I am Mary. It is interpreted by the person who experiences it, and sometimes not even she herself. Sometimes children tell of an apparition, and then the adults say, "What, you saw Mary?" In an attempt to categorize the experience, the projections are made, and these may ultimately be far away from the actual experience.
Are there studies that show that people who have led a strictly religious life and therefore have very concrete ideas about the afterlife are more likely to have corresponding concrete experiences than other non-religious people?
That would be exciting to investigate, but it would probably be difficult to do. At least I don't know of any investigation or study that has attempted this. That is a problem. How do we define, find and localize strictly religious people? And then I see another problem. In strictly religious, conservative milieus, there are often few concrete ideas about the afterlife because it is even frowned upon. It is astonishing how little the monotheistic religions, not only Christianity, but also Islam and Judaism, think about the afterlife and how little they say about an afterlife. And how often this question is not even allowed to be asked in fundamentalist circles. It's taboo. You're not allowed to answer it. In this respect, it may even be the other way around. People with a strong faith may have fewer expectations and not even know what to expect. In contrast, less religious but strongly spiritual people often have more concrete ideas and can formulate what they think might be in store for them.
In other words, what do near-death experiences actually tell us about concepts of God, for example, or about leading religious figures?
I can't answer this question specifically, but I can describe a basic framework. It is striking that it is precisely not the content of a near-death experience that one is taught. Neither is one's own opinion corrected, nor is there any specific instruction, such as, you don't know anything about Elijah, or whatever. And you have to realize what would happen in near-death experiences if that were the case. If perhaps Muslims were lucky enough to be the true believers, then all Christians would probably have to recognize this. They might pass a stern-looking figure on their way who says to them, "How often have you walked past the Quran and not picked it up?" So you have no idea about Muhammad, let alone Fatima and the others. Such an afterlife would therefore be precisely defined. The doctrine would be very important. The experience would be completely aligned with the doctrine and this true faith. But this is not the case, fortunately. The doctrine plays a subordinate role. It is not any doctrine that seems important, but the love, the feelings that one has based on one's decision and actions. This is also the reason why religion often no longer plays a major role for near-death experiences, but life, quality and feelings do. Spirituality plays a role, no longer the teachings of a particular denomination.
Can we summarize by saying that near-death experiences are rather a confirmation that religious ideas, doctrines and denominations are only a kind of crutch, and that it is really about something else, something deeper?
Yes, that is the case, and people who want to be or are religious sometimes have problems with this. People sometimes try to solve this problem by selectively choosing reports from near-death experiences that fit in with what they themselves believe. Everything else is ignored. Or people say that doesn't exist, or these are hallucinations. There are many near-death experiencers who go to the priest in church and talk about their experiences, and then get an answer like this. They can't do anything with it. This creates a conflict between the content of near-death experiences and what people who have not had such experiences want to believe.
To what extent do near-death experiences change the religiosity of the person concerned? Can we say something general about this?
Yes, it goes in the direction that I briefly mentioned earlier, that spirituality is becoming important, but religion is losing importance. But there are also people who weren't religious before, but have been going to church since their near-death experience. You can't say anything standardized about this. However, studies have shown that spirituality is becoming much more important than denominational doctrine.
So, if near-death experiences cause surprises and also change existing ideas, can we conclude from this that the thesis that near-death experiences simply fulfill expectations is simply wrong?
Yes, we are faced with a major problem that is almost impossible to solve. We only know the conscious mind. If we want to judge whether what someone has experienced corresponds to previous expectations, then we can only question the conscious mind. If we are lucky, the near-death experiencer is able to tell us about their experience. That alone is difficult enough, but it is similar to a dream or a drug-induced psychosis. There is also a lot of unconsciousness involved. We have to assume that in a near-death experience, as in dreams or psychosis, the brain and a lot of the unconscious also plays a part. Since Sigmund Freud at the latest, we have known that it is quite difficult and also questionable to access this unconsciousness. So how do we want to understand how much such an experience is characterized by the unconscious? If a Hindu encounters Jesus in a near-death experience, or if a Christian is shown his previous lives on earth and learns that reincarnation exists, then this could well be unconscious content that is projected into the experience. This presents us with a problem in the evaluation of near-death experiences. Even if we assume that we are dealing with the experiences that are not only produced by the brain, which is clear to all near-death experiences anyway, the unconscious could still play a role. It could help shape the experience or provide certain projections. There are indications of this. Nothing can be ruled out with certainty.
Whether conscious or unconscious expectations, what could be the reason that the brain produces such experiences?
Materialists will probably have problems with this question. If you want to explain near-death experiences in materialistic terms, you could point to the theory that such experiences make evolutionary sense because they take away people's fear of death. But that seems to me to be a wild theory, because how does evolution work? It selects in the sense that those who are better adapted have more offspring. This makes it difficult to establish a connection with experiences close to death. We know that 300 genes distinguish us from chimpanzees, 300 proteins, and they are supposed to generate such complex experiences. That doesn't really seem logical to me. When I die, the genes are no longer interested in what I experience, because I can no longer pass it on anyway. They can't care whether I experience the dying process positively or not.
So there is no recognizable evolutionary advantage?
No.
What do you think speaks in favor of the theory that near-death experiences are not a projection of the brain, but that they are actual experiences?
I don't think there are any facts that allow for definitive answers. But apart from the content of near-death experiences, there is a remarkable element, namely the supersenses. If near-death experiences were constructed by the brain, then one would have to assume that, as in a dream, we have the unconscious and the conscious, but that everything is somehow connected to the known. A tree, a fruit, whatever I perceive has a certain color or smell. However, odors probably don't exist in dreams because we usually can't remember or recall odors. We are bound to the basic structures. There are also things in dreams that we don't recognize from everyday life. The ability to move quickly in time in a topos that occurs very frequently. But in near-death experiences, it goes beyond that. Supersenses are added, which are reported again and again. Sensory impressions that have never been experienced before.
For example,
that I can suddenly have a 360-degree view, perceive everything around me, and what I am interested in becomes a focus. Or conversely, that my perception is like a sphere, that I can perceive an object from all sides at the same time, or that I see everything spread out at once in my life panorama. These are things that you can't describe, that you don't know, but they are very often experienced in near-death experiences. This is a qualitative leap, not just a quantitative one. There is something different. There are other time dimensions. There are perhaps similar or identical experiences in drug-induced psychosis. But here too, I ask myself, are these experiences produced by the brain? I see a gap that is difficult to bridge. I was once a student in Pakistan, in the Swat Valley, a very beautiful valley. Today it's a pretty fundamentalist country, but it used to be beautiful there. Back then I smoked a lot of hashish with a colleague. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. It was full of water stains. I lay on the bed and I saw structures everywhere in these water stains. A monkey, a car. Suddenly, there were structures everywhere. And the next day, when I was sober again, I could actually find them again. I would never have seen them, but they were there. Of course, that was just my imagination. Something like that is different from a real dimensional change. But my hypothesis is that drugs loosen perception as we know it, before it really goes into another dimension. There is evidence for this. Some time ago, I was approached by a woman from Austria who was interested in near-death experiences. She had discovered that these experiences had great parallels to her own experience, a drug experience. She had poisoned herself with datura seeds at a young age. This dangerous poisoning leads to a psychosis with confused, but sometimes also transcendental content. The woman experienced some embarrassing situations and wanted to forget everything afterwards. She wanted nothing more to do with her drug experience. But many years later, a decisive moment occurred, because something she had seen in her psychosis actually materialized in exactly the same way. What she had seen seemed like a warning to her. She actually experienced a vision of the future. And if you take such a story as true, and I have no doubt that it is true, then something happened here that cannot simply be explained as a brain function. So I assume that drug psychoses are not just a matter of the brain. There are dimensions that are transcendent. And that fits in with near-death experiences. If supersenses are developed here, then such experiences cannot be explained by the brain alone. It is obvious that it is about opening up to other dimensions. And apart from the supersenses, there is another point that speaks in favor of the authenticity of near-death experiences, and that seems very important to me: their after effects. We know of nothing comparable. Normally, a near-death experience is so hyper-real, so formative, even if it has taken place in just 1 or 2 seconds, that it turns your whole life upside down. It shapes your life from that moment until the end, every day. You hear that again and again. There's no denying it. It is a very profound experience that has a completely different quality to a dream. It is definitely a completely different experience. In a dream, reality is always reduced. In a near-death experience, it is extremely heightened. When it comes to the question of what speaks in favor of these real experiences, I think these aspects are very important. The supersenses, the paranormal quality that can be seen in verified out-of-body experiences, for example, and the after effects of hyper-real near-death experiences that turn your whole life upside down. In my opinion, these aspects are more important than the content.
The topic of sensory experience that you have raised here is extremely interesting. I suggest that we explore it in more depth at the next opportunity, in another installment of Thanatology Up-to-Date. Thank you very much for this interview, Dr. Eberhard. All the best. See you next time.
Thank you.